Hello, everybody. My name is Vari Drennan. I'm chairing this event. It's a great pleasure. We are in for a treat this evening, or it may be morning, depending on which part of the globe you're in. And it's lovely to see so many people from different parts of the world. I'm the Vice Chair of the History of Nursing Forum at the Royal College of Nursing, and I'm also a Professor of Healthcare and Policy Research at Kingston University in London. It's a most great pleasure that I'm here to be able to introduce this event. It's part of the Library and Museum exhibition series on nursing and climate change and the climate crisis. The Royal College of Nursing in the UK is a membership organisation, but it's just great to have so many people, as I've said already, from across the world and from different parts of the UK. The History of Nursing Forum aims to protect, preserve, share and cherish nursing heritage and promote members' interest in the history of nursing. So I hope you'll enjoy this event as much as I'm going to. I've got a few housekeeping details just to let you know first of all. Many of you are probably familiar with Zoom, but just in case, and I have to say I'm not terribly myself, all the attendees will be on mute throughout the event. And we suggest you turn off your video by clicking on the camera symbol. This will improve your connection as it reduces bandwidth. If you're having trouble with Zoom, try leaving the event and clicking on the link to rejoin. Please remember the chat is a public forum and everyone can see your comments, including speakers. And there is an option to message the host privately. We'll have an opportunity after the talks to ask questions, and you can type them in the chat as we go through or at the end, or and you can raise your hand in the reactions button. So the format for the evening is that we've got two talks. We're going to do them one after the other, followed by question and answer. And that the event will end around 9:10, but it is being recorded and there will be opportunities to see it later on. So with no further ado, and in order to keep to time, it's with great pleasure that I introduce, first of all, Peter Brimblecombe, Emeritus Professor in Atmospheric Chemistry, who is currently joining us from Hawaii, but is Emeritus Professor from the University of East Anglia in the UK. He's got long-term interest in changes in urban air pollution and its effect on health and building damage. And the historical aspects of this work formed the subject of a book, The Big Smoke, History of Air Pollution in London Since Medieval Times. And he's recently focused on Victorian and Edwardian Britain, but you'll see from his presentation that he goes much further than that. So with no further ado, can I please hand over and will you welcome Peter Brimblecombe? Thank you.
Well, hi everybody. I think you can see I'm wearing an aloha shirt just to prove that I really am in Hawaii. Okay, it's great fun to be able to talk to you all about a topic that I've really been interested in since my undergraduate days. And it always surprises people how very long the history of air pollution really is. And in terms of the notion that air pollutants affect health, we can go right back to the Hippocratic corpus, where the properties of air are linked to the state of health of individuals. And other Roman writers in the classical period, Vitruvius wrote about the architecture of ancient cities and the way proper provision of air was very important. And Nero's tutor, Seneca, the playwright, suffered badly from asthma. So whenever he was in Rome, he felt the oppressive air of the city affected him very deeply. But I really want to talk about the period in Britain from the 13th century through to the middle of last century, when the major air pollution legislation was passed. Now, legislation is really very important to air pollution. So it's not surprising with the 13th century feudal society at its very peak, and with London as this growing capital, that you saw laws develop about air pollution. So we can examine the way in which these laws arrived and then sort of see how air pollution arises in a city. So here are the sort of the incidents of air pollution, and you see there's this particular peak in air pollution in the late 1200s. And it rises and we get this large number of incidents in the early years of the 1300s. So this is a big change. So we probably need to question, well, why is it? Why does air pollution suddenly arise at this period? And we get a really good hint about this because there are royal proclamations of the late 13th century, but also we can see it in the way orders of fuel occur. So here's Henry III, and in 1253, he ordered a boatload of oak brushwood in order to make cement, to power kilns. And just look, a few years later, at a very similar order for the same king. So here, buy a boatload of coal. So over a period of 11 years, there's been a transition from wood to coal. And I think this is a first clue about air pollution. Dramatic changes in fuel lead to air pollution because we're unfamiliar with its use. We're unfamiliar with how to respond to it. So the question then becomes, well, what drove this change? So if we look at the pricing of wood in London across the late 13th century into the next century, what we can see is that the price of wood was increasing very dramatically. The growing city, successful growing city, was depleting its supplies of wood. And so this is really very, very critical. So now if you look at this and you compare this to the prices of coal, what you see is that coal essentially remained constant in price across this period. So any good industrials is clearly going to switch from one fuel to another. And so this means that essentially it's an economic driver to this fuel transition. And coal was here used largely to make cement in very large quantities. Thousands of tons sometime were ordered to make cement. And you see here in this picture, you see a lime kiln, great smoke coming out of the lime kiln, and that was the industrial use. And what you also see is the domestic use of coal is limited because what you can see in these houses in the background, they don't have chimneys. So this meant that charcoal was the preferred fuel because you can burn it indoors, essentially without a chimney. So this was the early period, an industrial period for the use of coal. So if we look after that, in the centuries that followed with Black Death and lowered populations and higher wages in the countryside, what it meant was that wood became more available. And so really the amount of smoke generated from coal became less important. But by 1600, it had changed again. And now what we find is a rising interest in air pollution, and essentially the sources had shifted. The coal was no longer being burnt in industrial premises only. It was being used in domestic premises, and because the development of the chimney had become pretty much universal in houses, so they were able to burn coal for heating and cooking, a very dramatic change. Now, at this particular period, rather than there being any kind of legislative or popular outcry, the outcry was academic. And one of the most notable writers on this subject was the diarist John Evelyn. John Evelyn really saw that, that coal was being used in large quantities. He wrote a book, Fuma Fugum, in 1661 that described the air pollution as we would know it from coal burn, the smoke, the smell, the potential for heavy metals such as arsenic and selenium, antimony, and so on. He was a real environmentalist, and part of his interest in environmentalism often meant that he neglected the economic realities of getting rid of coal as a fuel. So although he created many schemes to improve London's air, moving industry to the east of the city, he was never able to really implement them. And even after the Great Fire, his plans to move industry away from London to lower air pollution never became a reality. What we also find at this time is that scientists in general tried to apply scientific theory to what they saw as the damaging effect of coal. And Sir Kelm Digby wrote this interesting book where he tried to say that, well, the reason that coal smoke is so damaging, that it has a volatile salt, it has very sharp atoms in the smoke. And if we think of contemporary acid-base theory, acids were seen as atoms that had sharp points that could attack materials and the lung and so on. And alkalis were seen as kind of hollows that could blunt the point, that could cover the points of these sharp atoms. So here's a really early attempt to have a kind of atomic theory of coal burning. And it's sad to say, Digby stole these ideas from a very lovely early woman scientist, Margaret Cavendish, who wrote several years earlier than Digby about these notions of sharp atoms in coal. Wonderful dresser, this lady, very low-cut dresses, and in fact, her dressing was so outrageous, she wasn't allowed to join the Royal Society in the 1660s. It was being formed. I blame her for women taking so long to be admitted to the Royal Society. In terms of nursing, we also see a role for women nurses, some as searchers going and examining and determining causes of death in bodies found in London, in houses. And here you see some searchers, typically elderly ladies, and they assigned cause of death. And that cause of death was then used to assemble the bills of mortality for London from the late Elizabethan period, although not always continuous. And a really interesting man, John Graunt, took these records provided by the searchers and tried to understand what he could about London. And he believed that the high death rate in London was due to a number of factors, of which coal smoke was a very important one. And we can see the role of coal smoke here, the winter of 1679. What we find that in the top graph, the weeks with lots of fogs are weeks that are followed by very high death rates in the bottom graph. And these death rates rose largely among the elderly, and they tended to be pulmonary disease, all attributed to the presence of coal smoke. So you can model a parallel rise in coal smoke concentrations, or the sulfur dioxide from coal smoke, and the number of foggy days in London from about 1700 through to the present. And what we see, it rises to this kind of peak around 1900, when the use of coal was very, very high. London's coal rose across from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s from 1 to 5 million tons a year. And of course, we had the development of the steam engine. And scientists began to look at this. So here we see not the production of pollution, but we see the deposition of pollution. They placed little tins on the roofs of all the fire stations in London, and they were able to come back and analyze the sulfate in those small tins on fire station roofs. And what you see here that the pollution is driven with a prevailing wind down towards the poorer eastern parts of London, where the concentrations are much higher and the pollution sticks kind of to the river valley. And so this meant there was also a poverty issue here. Poorer people lived in more polluted areas. This understanding of the relationship between health, pollution, and death rates, for example, became a part or incorporated into the whole 19th century public health reform, these heroic transitions in Britain, with Chadwick and Farrar being drivers, although mostly their interests tended to be in things like sewers, housing, but there were smoke clauses within the kind of legislation that derived from their work. And they also saw the need for key professionals in this, sanitary inspectors or smoke inspectors and local medical officers of health. So after 1847, local authorities could appoint medical officers of health, they could appoint inspectors of nuisance, and by the 1870s, this had become very general throughout Britain. These inspectors largely reported to health committees. They were responsible for the day-to-day implementation of sanitary regulations. But the sad thing was they tended to draw in people who had failed in other walks of life. So it wasn't necessarily attracting the best people to the profession. So by the 1890s, there was a strong drive for professionalization. And the creation of a profession was an important opportunity for women at this point, because the sanitary inspectors, what we'd call health inspectors, environmental officers, was a new job. And so women flocked to these kind of roles. And what you see is, you see that in these graphs, this is a pass-fail rate. These fails are green and the passes are red to celebrate. And women and men are applying frequently for these, to pass these examinations. Women tend to pass them more frequently, and the various colleges are along the bottom. But the one I particularly want to draw your attention to is Bedford College, because that was a women's college and very, very successful. Sadly, its success was strangely criticized because inspectors felt the sanitary courses there were too theoretical. They taught ridiculous subjects like microscopy and bacteriology, just how terrible. And they did get some practice, because I love this little set of toy plumbing devices, which the women were taught on how to think about the plumbing and sanitary fixtures of buildings. Out of this course came an amazing group of women. This course at Bedford College was really amazing. Hilda Martindale, the Deputy Chief Factories Inspector of the time. We have women coming from abroad. My real heroine, Sumi Miyakawa, came from Japan and ultimately transformed domestic economy teaching in Japan, and so on. So really, a really strong group of people, with women gaining equal number of certificates to become sanitary inspectors around 1900. There were some concerns, for example, about clothing, long dresses in abattoirs. You know, could women have brass buttons and so on? Could they climb ladders? And always the question of marriage and family. But interestingly, salaries were pretty much equal at this early time, which was just great for women entering the dress force. And I just love the interest in rational dress. How could women dress in order to take these roles? So there was, I think, an amazing opportunity here. Sadly, that transformation wasn't always successful. And in the early part of the 20th century, women started to be pushed out of this. The technology led to men taking over more technical roles and women moving more into a health visitor role. And this led to a kind of reduction in status in the early 20th century for these women who'd largely been very successful for about 20 years. So we move on through the 20th century and we end up in 19 1952 with the Great Smog, a period of 5 days of very intense pollution where probably 4,000 to 12,000 people died. And this was incredible. Even at the time, it was certainly very, very obvious. Having suffered the Blitz, people were very aware of large death rates, but this was a massive number to die in a single week of smog. So it led for enormous pressures for legislation. And there are a lot of popular images that still resonate throughout the history books. But we don't think how simple some of these were. Some young man who was a young man in the smog complained to me he couldn't play football. He hated the smog because it was a Saturday the smog occurred. So the buses were cancelled, football was cancelled, animals were suffering, people got lost on the way home and so on. So there were public images of the smog. But there were also facts and fictions that persist. This notion that everybody was wearing gas masks, there were mass graves, that the response was delayed. In fact, it was discussed in Parliament in the early weeks of January of 1953. So the delay wasn't really critical, and the legislation moved forward quite nicely. And I also love this image of a woman who's really able to combine fashion and coping with the smog. So what we have is a possibility of this large number of deaths. Nobody really knows how many people died. Could be 4,000, that was the number at the time. Influenza was sometimes blamed for another increase to 12,000, but many of those were probably attributable to the air pollution and were just long-term illnesses. What was the outcome? Well, the outcome was the Beaver Committee, finally a private members bill by Gerald Narborough, and ultimately the Clean Air Act of 1956. We know that. What we don't always know is really how many people died. Still a question of what was the role of particulate matter, what was the role of sulfur dioxide in doing this. A lot of people at the time said, hey, what's wrong? We've got a Public Health Act of 1936. Surely that's got smoke clauses. And they were also worried that the new legislation challenged personal freedom. It, for the first time, tried to control not only industrial, but also domestic emissions. And this was critical, I believe, because the legislation was the chimney of any building, not just an industrial premise. So I think it's a critical piece of legislation. It's the first kind of realization that environmental regulation will restrict our freedoms. So the structure of the Act was such, it had many more clauses compared to the Public Health Act. It detailed, all the detail was in the memoranda. So, the Act was about a principle, and you find all the technical detail in memoranda, something that we find even today in European Commission legislation. There were, of course, doubts about whether this was going to work, and I love this letter of 1955 saying there won't be enough smokeless fuel. So every time you pass environmental legislation, you get these kind of doubts. However, it worked. In the end, it worked. Everything declined, sulfur dioxide, smoke went down. I'm not sure it's entirely due to the Act. It's probably due to people preferring an electric stove to a coal-burning stove. The cost of servants had risen enormously during the war, so no one likes to clean their own coal grate. And even though the legislation didn't address sulfur dioxide, it did in parallel lead to a reduction in sulfur dioxide concentrations. So if we reflect on the Clean Air Act of 1956, I think what's important is not so much that the Act itself, which I think just continued improvements to air pollution that were already underway because of changes in our way of living, but it said something about our concept of the environment. We wouldn't be able to have bonfires in our gardens any longer under newer regulations. We'd have to regulate indoor spaces. We'd have to regulate the kind of furniture we have indoors. We're not free to choose those things. Personal freedom, we have to choose to have automobiles more regulated. We have the congestion charges dating way back. We have, school bus runs being encouraged and so on. So it was really important the way this legislation changed a way of thinking about our personal freedoms. Of course, all that's kind of kind of gone now. It's history. The Clean Air Act of 1956 has kind of been repealed and it's incorporated into other legislation. London has really changed. We no longer think of London as this old coal-burning, fog-bound city. In fact, if anything, it's a city of very modern. The big smoke has transformed itself into a kind of modern pollution that perhaps resembles LA, Los Angeles, more than anything else, this summer photochemical pollution. And I think the iconography here is just wonderful, that advertising of cigarettes and calling London the big smoke, but a very modern London. So, of course, change continues. We now have increasing vehicle regulations. We adopt Euro standards. Pollution has declined, but there are lower amounts in general, but problems become more subtle. The kind of pollutants we worry about become more subtle. So we end up there with a situation that's really quite different and continuing. So there's still the need for thinking about these problems, even though we've cleaned the bad old days of the past. So I would like to end there and indeed pass over to Tracey, I think is next. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Lots of food for thought there, and I can see people making comments in the chat, which is great. Feel free to put questions in or thoughts. And now it's with great pleasure. So we'll have an opportunity for questions to Peter and comments to Peter after the next talk, for those of you who've joined us in the middle. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you our next speaker, who is Tracey Cooke, who is a steering committee member of the Royal College of Nursing's Public Health Forum. And she has over 30 years of experience in the field of occupational health nursing. She has a particular interest in mental health issues in the work environment, but also in the history of occupational nursing in the United Kingdom. And she's published on both her experience and the history of occupational nursing in RCN journals. So with no further ado, can I hand over you to Tracey, who's going to talk through some of the history of public health nursing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie, for that. And thank you, everybody, for participating in this webinar. Peter's kindly gone through the very beginning of origins in terms of probably where public health nursing did start a long, long time ago, but I'm focusing on the period mainly from the at the start of the pre-industrial revolution onwards, which started about the 18th century. Now, public health per se at the moment covers various disciplines in relation to district nursing, health visiting, occupational health nursing, and my obvious specialty is occupational health. So I will focus mainly on the occupational health side of it, but I'm hoping that through this talk, people will begin to identify the other disciplines within public health that we're beginning. Peter's already talked about the health visiting aspect and discipline of public health, but through some of the things we're going to talk about and the conditions and living conditions, hopefully you'll begin to see where where public health started to develop. So the birth of public health, if we go back to the pre-industrial revolution, most people were living in rural areas, while Peter talked about cities and that. The general population lived in rural areas where they did have cleaner air, they had better living conditions, but it wasn't without its challenges. Obviously, living in the countryside, medical knowledge and access to medicine was still very limited, and diseases that we easily treat today could have been killers back then in the 18th century, with medical knowledge being very poor. Diet was very limited to food that they could grow or they could catch locally. So diets in a lot of ways were restricted, but they did actually the food was homegrown. they reared their own animals, they killed their own meat, they grew their own produce. So I'm sure that some of these people in the rural areas would have had a healthier diet than the ones living in the cities. The around this time as well, a lot of the industry was in cottage industries, where there were the weavers that we used to produce wool and cotton and things in their own homes. That the women used to tend to do this at their looms while the men went out on the land. So it was very, very different to the picture that Peter has also portrayed that was popularly happening as well in the cities, but on a smaller scale to what it was going to be building into. And obviously, the work then was very physical. There wasn't any sedentary work that we get now. And whilst I couldn't find any research on the respiratory problems in the people in the rural areas, it's very clear that in the urban areas, it was becoming a problem. Next slide, please. So around 1750, the Industrial Revolution began. Goods were being produced. It led to a growth in factories. There was, coal was being used. Steam was being a new invention. And so those traditional cottage industries moved from basically the homegrown ones, and they moved into the towns. And these towns multiplied very quickly. As the factories multiplied, as demand for the goods increased. So therefore the demand for workers did. The workers from the countryside saw that this was a good opportunity for employment. So a lot of the population migrated from these rural areas to the urban areas. And obviously, the employment opportunities were increased, were more available, and this obviously was a big draw for the population and for feeding families and for growing families. So this massive migration of people, the urban towns that that we know now began to grow and grow from the small little townships into cities. And between 1801 and 1901, during the late Georgian Victorian period, these major centres became a lot bigger, and the populations increased as a result. Next slide, please. So what were the changes that were occurring? Well, obviously, as the urban populations grew, the living conditions in a lot of these areas in the cities were poor. This actually again began to contribute to widespread health problems. But at the same time, the Industrial Revolution led to this increase in science and engineering. But on the other end of the spectrum, these increases in science and engineering, where more machines were being used, there was more pollution being created. This led to a more decline in general health as well. And these living conditions in these towns and cities, the sanitation was poor, and that would link in then with what Peter was saying in regarding there was interest around sewers at that time. Disease was becoming more widespread, overcrowding, and obviously poor nutrition, because they weren't getting they weren't growing their own anymore, because they were very a lot of not concrete then, but stones, backyards, no gardens. Next slide, please. So to help this increase in population, factory owners started to actually build their own houses, like our little housing estates now, where they would purpose-built these housing complexes that were built around the factory. And these workers, so they didn't have to travel home, they just go out of the factory and straight home. And there's there's one actually in Saltaire, Bradford. I don't know if anybody's ever visited that, but that's still being preserved from the area, from the mills around there. And that's actually how it was back in the Industrial Revolution, with the houses, how the living conditions that they lived in. The houses were terraced, no semi-detached or detached as we've got now. The families, which were very large families, were crammed into small spaces, and a lot of them used to share houses, so they were often living in single rooms as well. There was no clean running water, there was no proper sanitation, and again, the sewerage systems, where the poor sanitation was, there wasn't the effective sewerage systems to actually be taking the human waste out. And the toilets actually could have been shared between several houses. We've heard of the back-to-back houses where they used to have one toilet at the back, where everybody used to go and fight to get on first before everybody else. So next slide, please. So have we got talked about there's no adequate water supply? The water actually came from pumps in the streets that were sourced and supplied by the rivers, but in turn, a lot of the pollution from these factories and industries were actually going straight into these rivers and streams, and the rivers were heavily polluted. So it wasn't a combination of both industrial and human waste. So there was a lot of problems with accessing clean water. The working hours were long, up to 12 to 14, 16 hours a day sometimes. These areas very quickly became slums due to this rapid population increase, obviously because of the poor sewerage systems. There wasn't the sanitation, there wasn't the bins like we have today, where they come and collect our bins every 2 weeks now instead of every week. So the conditions were becoming increasingly unhygienic, and disease quickly spread. And obviously this disease then quickly led to illness and to death. Next slide, please. So the slums were ideal breeding ground for diseases, illness and death. Around 1831, there was the first outbreak of cholera, and that killed 50,000 people then. And that was spread through contaminated food or water. The symptoms included diarrhea, vomiting, leading to dehydration and death. So if you imagine the sewerage system wasn't adequate, there wasn't adequate water supply, so they would have quickly got dehydrated. The diarrhea they were experiencing, this vomiting were going into the streets and into the rivers and into the toilets that they shared with a lot of people. Typhoid was also very prevalent around this time, and that was contaminated food or water. Again, water is a key as well, and we look at the water supply. So it's when we look at the actual pollution of air, I think we need to be looking at the environmental impact from water as well. So with typhoid, the symptoms included fever, fatigue. This again spread quickly. And again, this goes back to the poor sanitation and the inadequate water supplies. I think we can see a theme developing here. Next slide, please. So touching on air pollution, which Peter's talked quite a lot about, in the industrial revolution, the air pollution was very bad with the chimneys that were being built in these towns. The machines were working up to 18 hours a day from the steam, the coal, everything that was being burnt for fuel. This was going into the air. So they needed the power. So all these factories, the mills, the steam engines, they all contributed as well to this air pollution. And as Peter's talked about smog, it began to blanket urban areas. And again, as Peter's touched on, it was beginning to cause serious damage to the health of people. And it was around this time they were beginning to think that was there a correlation between some of the working conditions and the air pollution and the environmental impacts. So a lot of people around this time were beginning to get breathing difficulty, damaged lungs. It contributed to a range of breathing difficulties. And don't forget about this time as well, to fuel this industry, There was needing coal, and obviously there were people going down the mines. So people were working in damp conditions down the mines, where their conditions were equally as poor as well, which led to their own health issues relating, to working in mines. So one of the main issues around that time was the air quality. So next slide, please. So as I've said, there were beginning to be thoughts around maybe this correlation between health and work on health, and the pollution. The traditionalists, the factory owners and things were beginning to were unwilling. They weren't prepared to invest in cleaning and improving towns and cities due to the high costs involved, because obviously this would affect their profit margins, and they were out to make money. And whilst there was work going on in terms of looking at the positives of cleaning the environment, the working conditions, they used to clean the walls in factories with lime at one bit, thinking that would help with having clean walls instead of the dark, smoky, dusty walls. There were a lot of the owners weren't prepared to do that. But then you've got the other side of the coin, where you've got these reformers that were beginning to identify this and were really beginning to take note of it. They were wanting to invest in cleaning the towns and the cities, but actually you had this disparity where at that time profit was actually becoming, it was more important at that time. But it took the things like the cholera outbreak, scientific breakthroughs in tackling these diseases to actually start to begin to take notice. And the government slowly began to have pressure put on it to start to legislate and make changes. So around 1851, around this period, through the cholera and the typhoid, the government did start to invest in the new sewerage system in London, which developed in 1858. And what they began to find was that the cholera outbreaks actually significantly ended, and that was a key moment in is relating the sanitation, the cleaning, the clean air, the water, with those kind of diseases that were becoming more and more prevalent. So if next slide, please.
Tracey,
So,
it's Ari here. You've got about 4 minutes.
oh my God, sorry. Very quickly. Anyway, some of the slides, these are the public health facts that were that began to frame the public health that we know today. They're self-explanatory. I'm not going to go through them, but this was the start of the beginning of the Public Health Acts. So next slide, please. Sorry, I see. I can gasp for Britain. Anyway, there is some of the working conditions that I've touched upon. Even though they worked long hours, the wages were low, dirty conditions. There was little or no workers' rights. People were beginning to get physically burnt out, repetitive work. A lot of these are familiar with occupational health at the moment. And what was common then was child labour to supplement the household income. And that was how I see the start to the health visitors and the district nurses. Carry on to the next slides, please. Just a little bit more about the working conditions. Peter has talked about the clothing as well. Fashion and everything was also discussed in the factory, about the kind of things that the women should particularly be working. And at that time, the government's had a bit of a laissez-faire attitude, because we wonder why the government wasn't doing more. At that time, it was very much driven by the industrialists, and the government did little at that time to protect the workers from all these health hazards. Next slide, please. And then that's the early beginning, where we talked about the men of wealth began to see the value, and this is where nurses started to become see more of value. Industrial nursing focused more on protection, and the progressive area, a lot of areas hats through Parliament around this time, where they were looking at the relationship between of work and health, and work on health being become a little bit more prominent. Next slide, please. Some of the earlier occupational diseases, a lot of musculoskeletal injuries, deformities, particularly from working and cleaning the between the machines. They had poor eyesight because there was poor light, no windows in some of these buildings. Dermatitis, skin problems, respiratory problems we've talked about, and obviously ultimately death. The next slide just talks about Philippa Flowerday from an occupational health point of view, about how she began to influence the first nursing in industrial nursing with some of the health effects. And she was actually originally employed as a district nurse in Coleman's mustard factory. So, you know, that going before we start talking about occupational health nursing, district nursing was about then as well. And then she was looking at crinolines and about saying how inappropriate they were working, again, the fashion industry working between these electrical looms. Next slide, please. So obviously, there's the aspects of public health. It's moved from more reactive. It's gone to a more preventive form of nursing. Legislation was passed. Nurses needed to adapt to the fast-paced industrial transformation. And then there were the early adopters of holistic care that were often found in the workplace to fully understand the correlation of work and health. And I think next slide is the last one. No, it would have been. And obviously, public health policies were developed. It beginning to emerge. Public health was beginning to emerge from the Industrial Revolution, about the importance of that. And public health became a major concern for employers and government because obviously, with increased absence and illness and everything. Sorry, I'm rushing at the end here. I think last slide, please. And that's to say we've come a long way, thank you. I'm very sorry about rushing that. It is my first webinar, so I do apologise for that, but the slides will be available, I'm sure.
Thank you, Tracey. Vari here, and I apologise for interrupting your flow. Just slightly concerned, as I knew the amount of ground you were going to try and cover, that
Yeah.
in terms of the timing. So I do apologise, and I think I've been accused of running Amazon in the chat in terms of timings. So I apologise for that. But what I did want to do was be able to give people the opportunity to ask some of those questions and make those points. We've got a lot of thank yous, can I just say, in the chat to both Peter and Tracey. And to both of you. I think you've covered an extraordinary amount of ground in a very short amount of time and given us lots of food for thought and lots of ideas about how the past might influence the present and what that might mean for the future. Oh, okay. So I'm being told it's the working conditions as Amazon. Okay, so it's not me keeping you all to time. Thank you. Thank you for that. I feel a bit better. I have to say there's such a lot of nice messages in the chat about how people have learned a lot, enjoyed it, found it interesting. And the RCN team have put up that there is an evaluation process, and they'd be really pleased if you could help with that. It helps boost whether we do these sorts of things for everybody in the future. So thank you if you could. Any final questions or comments?
Can I just say thank you for having me?
Well, indeed, me too. Thank you for having. I mean, I feel it's such an intellectual desert being in the middle of the Pacific. It has lots of other advantages, but this has been fantastic for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So if there are no other questions and no other final comments either Tracey or Peter would like to make. No, I think we're done. Can I just say it's been an absolutely splendiferous feast of interesting information, of ideas, of contributions, things I'm going to go away and look up and find out about. I was going to interrogate you more on Philippa Flowerday, but I will also go and read your article about her, Tracey, and find out a bit more about her that way. She sounds a woman after my own heart. And so can I say thank you to everybody here for coming. It's been absolutely, as I said, splendiferous, a real feast. And I hope you have a good rest of the day, night, wherever you are. And I hope we see you at more of these in the future. And so thank you. Lots of claps in the chat. Thank you so much to Tracey and Peter. Made my evening. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.